As I record this, we are in the season of Advent, which is a time of spiritual renewal and a preparation of a nativity of graces. And perhaps during this time you want to start something new, start a renewal in your own prayer life. Maybe you want to go to the traditional Mass for the first time, or maybe you've already been going to the traditional Mass every Sunday but want to make it more frequent. Well, to do this more effectively and to get more fruit out of the Mass, you might want to get a Missal, a daily Missal. And there's a lot of reviews about this online, but I think a lot of them miss crucial points. And in this video, we're going to be going over some of the most popular missals, why they are popular, and looking at some more obscure missals as well. Missals are books that Catholics use to follow along with what the priest says at Holy Mass. And these are kind of a new phenomenon within the Church. Before the printing press, missals were very often large, important, and valuable books that priests would use in order to say Mass in Latin correctly. Priests to this day still do this, allowing every Latin Mass to be exactly the same no matter where you are across the world. These books used to be called sacramentaries based on the word sacrament, but around the 8th century they started to be called missals based on the Latin word for Mass, missa. As the time went on and literacy increased, we gradually saw more and more lay people using books with the text of the Mass in it. We can see the early beginnings of this, especially in England around the 14th century with the Lay Folks Mass Book, which had devotions for the lay people and text for the Mass. But missals were large and cumbersome. Hand missals didn't start coming on the scene until about the 19th century, after Dom Prosper Garanger published the Liturgical Year, which explains in detailed 15 volumes the traditional liturgical readings for the Catholic Church. In the early 20th century, carrying on this legacy of Garanger, hand missals for laity were developed that give the translated text of the Mass for each day, along with explanations of the various feasts. After the Second Vatican Council, few people at the new Mass use hand missals, as the Mass varies greatly from place to place and the readings change year by year. But if you frequently go to a traditional Mass, the liturgical year and those hand missals are still just as worthwhile as they once were. You still might want one of those hand missals to enrich your participation in the Holy Sacrifice and understand the text better. There's a lot of poetry, art, and spiritual insight present there that you would miss if you didn't read the text of each Mass. Now there are these little missalettes, or booklets they call them, for the new Mass, and people sometimes just throw them away because they're only good for a year, and the translations have at times changed. Not to mention, it's all in the vernacular anyway. So in order to avoid confusion with missalettes for the new Mass, you're going to want to make sure the original publication date was 1962 or before. There are also small books. They are usually red that contain the ordinary of the Mass, so the part that doesn't change, depending on the feast or the season. But we are looking for premium products that contain everything you need to understand fully the traditional Latin Mass and its surrounding feasts. When it comes to choosing a hand missal, there is one thing in particular to be aware of: the 1955 Holy Week. In 1955, Pope Pius XII revised the Holy Week of the Mass, and these were not small changes. And so if you have a missal that was originally published before 1955, it will be nearly impossible to follow at your average traditional parish. Some communities have gained permission from the Holy See to use the pre-55 Holy Week, but most traditional parishes, such as the ones run by the SSPX, use the 1962 Missal, and therefore use the updated Holy Week. There were also different feasts implemented by Pius XII throughout the 1950s, including the Immaculate Heart of Mary, the Queenship of Mary, and St. Joseph the Worker. So if you buy a missal that was published before the implementation of those feasts, they won't be in there. In addition, in 1962, St. Joseph's name was inserted into the Roman canon, so missals before then will not have his name. When it comes to pre-1955 missals, there are usually only two that could get brought up in this conversation. These are known as being high-quality, good missals, and there's a reason why the consensus has formed around just a few missal editions. These are the ones that are high quality. They have things that you want, while the other ones have problems. They're missing things that these ones have, or relied too much on gimmicks, and we will talk about them later. The best two 1955 missals are the Father Lasance and the St. Andrew's Missal. The St. Andrew's Missal. This missal was put together by Dom Gaspar Lefebvre from the Benedictine Order. It was originally published in 1945, but for example, mine was published in 2003 as a reprint from St. Bonaventure Publications. This can be hard to find nowadays. It's sort of the cult classic of missals. It's not the most popular, but it might be the missal most loved by its enthusiasts, and for good reason. The woodcuts produced that illustrate the missal are by artist René de Crémer. I sincerely believe that these woodcuts are not only some of the best illustrations for missals, but are some of the best pieces of art of the 20th century. These illustrations also give a sense of movement and sacred elevation that I don't think any other missal really accomplishes. Of all the missals we are speaking of, the St. Andrew's Missal has the most thorough and complete notes for each feast, and that's what it's really known for. It's to the point where I would suggest reading the notes for each feast as spiritual reading the night before Mass. The Missal also contains a Kyriale with modern notation, so if you know how to read modern music but not Gregorian chant, you can read each of the Mass settings and sing them. It also has many standard prayers and devotions that are very useful, and the St. Andrew's Missal also contains something that I think gives it an edge, which is the text for Vespers and Compline, which many traditional parishes still have on Sunday after Mass. On the other hand, there is the Father Lasance Missal, a very popular one, and it's very clear that this missal was going for practicality. The explanations are very good, but much more succinct, and at the end of the missal. The illustrations are not very ornate, but show where the priest is during important moments, and many people like it because they feel that they don't have to flip around as much, even though myself, I don't find much of a difference. Something needs to be said about the decline in quality since its original publication in 1937. The original here was even thinner than the other missals that we're going to talk about today, and excellently bound with Moroccan leather. The modern one is significantly bulkier than any other missal, and not bound as well as it used to be, which sort of defeats the purpose of it being more functional and practical. The modern Father Lasance printings have very nice paper quality, so it's not like the others where sometimes you can feel in danger of ripping the paper, but it is gigantic. The Father Lasance has a huge plus with its beginning 50 pages or so, including a great study and devotional plan, Read Mass with the Priest by Father Kelly. However, this missal lacks a Kyriale, so there's no notation, Gregorian or standard, for the music of each Mass. It also lacks Vespers and Compline for Sunday, which are significant omissions. This missal was recently popularized by Dr. Taylor Marshall, but I must say, I'm not a huge fan. The modern versions are big and bulky, and yet lack those essential things like a Kyriale and parts of the Divine Office, meaning you might need to use other books at those occasions. Not to mention, you don't have the post-55 Holy Week in the Father Lasance. So if you want a full liturgical set for a modern traditional parish, you might need to carry 3 large books during Holy Week. The illustrations are inferior to those of the St. Andrew's Missal, and while the explanations are more succinct, they aren't as detailed. If you can find a 1930s copy, I think it's a solid missal to have, but they are usually quite expensive and rare. Outside of that, I personally cannot recommend it over the St. Andrew's. The Angelus Press Missal. When it comes to post-55 hand missals, many use the 1962 text. This originates from Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre's decision to have the Society of St. Pius X use that version. It should be no surprise then that the most common and most popular 1962 missal is published by the SSPX's publishing house, Angelus Press. This missal is largely based on Father Jurgen's The Ideal Missal. Father Jurgens was a prolific Marianist priest. There are also engravings in this text, but they aren't quite as beautiful or ornate as the St. Andrew's Missal. However, the missal is laid out in a very straightforward way. It contains many extra prayers, a Kyriale with chant notation, and contains Vespers and Compline for Sundays. The Baronius Press Missal. Baronius Press also publishes a missal based on the Father Jurgens text. In many respects, these missals are exactly the same, with a few notable exceptions. Firstly, the Angelus Press text has commentary on the Mass at the side of the ordinary. In my opinion, this makes the missal immediately superior, as let us remember that missals are supposed to help us pray and understand the Mass. The Baronius Press Missal, on the other hand, has very little commentary, but has larger text throughout. The Angelus Press Missal also has a fairly large and detailed introduction from Your Mass and Your Life by Father Beuron. The Baronius Press version, on the other hand, only contains the text of Summorum Pontificum from Pope Benedict XVI, which is now largely irrelevant. As a final note, I find that the standard Baronius version tends to be of higher quality than the Angelus version, but only slightly, and if you were to use a Missal cover, it wouldn't be noticeable. The genuine leather anniversary copy that Angelus publishes is in a completely different league. It feels good, has a premium feel, and in my opinion is worth the extra for the leather binding. With all this put together, I would recommend the Angelus version over the Baronius version for a post-1955-1962 Missal. If I had to pick one, I would pick the St. Andrew's Daily Missal. But what do you do about Holy Week? Well, Angelus Press sells a convenient copy of the new and updated Holy Week by itself, and yes, it contains the ordinary and everything you need to attend Holy Week, so you don't need to bring your Missal. And luckily, some of the newer feasts are sometimes printed at the back of the St. Andrew's Missal. But as a supplement, I can't recommend enough the St. Edmund Campion 3rd edition Missal published by Sophia Institute Press. I am shocked that this isn't more well known. This is really a spectacular work. It's a bit of an odd one. In its first printing, it was often the size of a hymnal and pretty difficult to carry around. It was awkwardly sized, but now it's more portable. It's still a bit larger than a normal Missal and has a traditional hardback cover, but its contents are beautiful. It contains both the pre-55 and updated Holy Week, the propers for many of the most notable feasts, and every feast for holy days and Sundays, along with beautiful illustrations for the ordinary of the Mass and a ton of scholarly information about the origins of the traditional Mass. People also really love this one because it contains the translation of the Mass by Father Knox, who had a very popular Bible translation and had a very beautiful writing style. This isn't a daily use for me as it lacks the daily propers, and I wish it had one more ribbon to easily flip through, but this is becoming a frequent Sunday carry for me. Now for the more obscure Missals. These are ones that are oftentimes out of print, not as well known, not as well loved, but there's some interesting stuff here. We can't talk about them all because practically every Catholic publishing house was making these at the time, and it seems like everyone was doing it. They had gimmicks and they had all kinds of things to get you to buy it, whether that be special introductions, special artworks, or just using celebrity priests to promote them. The Bishop Sheen Sunday Missal. Now, this Missal has more to it than it first might seem. This is a Sunday Missal, meaning it can't be used every day, only has the notable feast, much like the St. Edmund Campion Missal. However, it is structured like a normal Missal. It isn't sized awkwardly. However, unlike the St. Edmund Campion, it doesn't contain the interesting scholarly information or colorful photos, but it does have, for what it's worth, a small introduction by Bishop Fulton Sheen and a color photograph of him saying Mass. Bishop Sheen didn't have too much to do with the composition of this. A couple of Jesuits, Reverend Philip Caramon and Reverend James Walsh, arranged and produced the actual text. However, in some places, the influence of Bishop Sheen is obvious, which is what makes this text so interesting, and it's such a shame that this isn't in print. The best example of this is some of the English translations that are used. For example, Gerard Manley Hopkins is used for the Adoro Te, and Father Knox is used for the Lauda Sion. Now, there is very little explanation about the Mass, though some of the explanations at the beginning, especially about the vestments, is very useful. And the typeset is small, but is useful in that there is very little page turning. For each Mass, a good amount is repeated. There is very little imagery, but when it is used, it is very effective, and there is also no Kyriale or Vespers in Compline. I am left with this with a sort of feeling of what could have been. I wish we had a full daily Missal with commentary from Bishop Sheen on the side of the ordinary and for each feast, and that would have been amazing, but we have a great text in and of itself and in its own right here. The Father Stedman's Missal. Another one a lot like the Father Sheen Missal is the Father Stedman's Missal, and Father Stedman was said to have sold millions of copies during his lifetime. He was very popular during the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. Unfortunately, many people have simply forgotten about his work. But there are two Missals in particular which are noted for their historicity, but under the right conditions might be a good gift as well. One was the My Sunday Missal. This is a very small missal that could fit in your pocket, but it is also illustrated by Ade Bethune, who is involved in the Dorothy Day Catholic worker movement and is behind much of those illustrations, and that is the style, that's the aesthetic used here. The notes from Father Stedman aren't going to be too in-depth, so don't go looking for that, because again, this is a Sunday Missal and it's quite small. The Missal did see quite a few revisions, which includes the different rubric updates for the dialogue Mass and other notes. There is also a version version for Lent specifically called the My Lenten Missal. More interesting than that missal, though, is the Father Stedman's Military Missal. This is to be noted because it was published in 1942, so many of these, if they survived, probably saw some action in the Second World War. The Maryknoll Missal. One of the major Catholic publishers used to be P.J. Kennedy and Sons. They started in 1817 and they still run the official Catholic directory, which used to be a big deal before the internet, but they also produced Bibles, very nice Bibles, and missals. You will find pre-1955 Sunday missals by them arranged by Dominican fathers Collin and McHugh. These are really old-fashioned. I really wouldn't use them for today, but they are interesting for their historicity. In the 1950s, however, they started working with the Maryknoll Fathers, which is a recent religious order known especially for their work in Hong Kong and China. Kennedy and Sons worked with them and produced the Daily Missal of the Mystical Body, or the Maryknoll Missal, first in 1957 with the updated Holy Week and additional commentary on each feast. These are often beautifully bound in Moroccan leather, and so they are often in great shape. The ordinary itself, so the main part of the Mass, doesn't have that much commentary and has small illustrations throughout. Now, here is the make or break thing. The art used throughout is in high-quality color photographs of art in the Beuronese school. So the Beuronese school was a 19th and 20th art movement by the South German monks of Beuron. And that's what the K. Beuron citation is at the bottom of the images, which, from what I can tell, means Closter Beuron or the Abbey of Beuron. I will have an article by Father Kenneth Novak in the description explaining this art movement, but this has seen a significant revival recently. In particular, the SSPX seems to have taken a liking to this. Most notably, you can look at the new SSPX church in St. Mary's, Kansas, the Immaculata. Much of the art there is in this style. Now, this missal also saw a reprint in 1961, and from what I can tell, this reprint was to update some of the norms of the rubrics established in 1960 for when people should kneel, and new bindings were also made. None of the editions have a Kyriale or a Vespers and Compline, and it doesn't have the depth of commentary as some of the others mentioned here. But it is one of the best of these more obscure ones, and you can get them online. They are plentiful. Some outlets like Preserving Christian Publications still sells them used online. Now, here's where you can get fooled. After 1965, when the Second Vatican Council ended, many of these missal publishers went insane. And there are a few missals that were used in between the Mass of 62 and the Novus Ordo Mass. And these missals, published around 1965, won't be useful for anyone. And in the case of the Maryknoll Missal, the quality declined significantly. The art was completely changed in what they called the Vatican II edition, and really it lost its charm. This is only useful for a historical note, I would say, and other than that, do not get any of these 1965 missals. Make sure if you want a Maryknoll Missal that the publishing date says 1957 or 1961. The New Marian Missal. The New Marian Missal has seen a lot of printings, a lot of editions throughout the years, and it's still technically in print, but it's going to be objectively inferior to the other 1962 missals because it is the Father Jurgen's Missal, but it's just less refined and without the additional material that the Angelus Press or the Baronius Press editions have. There is one exception to this, which is that there is a pre-1955 edition of this with an imprimatur from Cardinal Spellman. So you will have a very strange, sort of unrefined copy of what you may be used to with the 1962 Missal, but with the pre-55 text. I think the awkwardness, or at least the age of this, stands out with how the text looks in some editions. It comes across to me as being more dated rather than antiquated or retro in a good way. This did see a lot of editions and reprints. There is a color illustration version, there's a large text version, there's a large text color illustration version. There's a lot of them. Now, if you did want to get one of these, I would only suggest that you get an older edition of a Regina Press edition. They did some really nice bindings on this. I can't speak to the new reprints, but I have seen some terrible print-on-demand copies of this, or at least mass production recent printings of this. If you're going to get it, get a nice old Regina Press one. The St. Joseph version. Many traditional Catholics consider the Douay-Rheims Bible translation to be the ideal Bible, and for good reason. We use the Bible translation a lot in our monthly newspaper. But this translation did undergo a revision with its New Testament in what was called the Confraternity version, which would later become the USCCB's New American Bible after the Second Vatican Council. Some people liked that early Confraternity translation, and it was used as a marketing tool, especially for the St. Joseph Daily Missal, even though the Maryknoll version used it as well. The St. Joseph Missal still exists, but for the Novus Ordo and in a cheap paperback copy. Or you could get a leatherback copy where you have to look through the various cycles to figure out where you are, but let's be honest, even with the average Novus Ordo, there is so much variety, it's all in the vernacular anyways, so these are quite anachronistic. The older original ones themselves have seen many editions. There are pre-1955 editions, 1962 editions, and even those 1965 transitional missals. The art is a mix of what you might see in a traditional catechism, and then color photos of realism art, which appeals to some and not to others, but these were very popular for the cover art of Catholic books back in the day. Some of the art here is nice, but the 1965 transitional missal, on the other hand, is completely modern in its art, very reflective of the time period. Overall, this is really a cookie-cutter missal. There's not the features that make the other ones stand out, and I think the modern reprint quality isn't going to be what you could get around the same price. So I would stay away from this one unless you want to get it for just the historical value. In conclusion, I think there are some people who might get bothered by this video. They might think that this is selling the Mass or making something that should be simple, going to Mass, into an overly particular study. The thing I love about traditional Catholicism, though, is that it can be as deep as you want it to be. You can go to a low Mass and just talk to Jesus there with no regard for the text. You can do that. If you want to sing in a schola or a choir and give yourself to God by finding Him in the rhythm and poetry of the chant, that's great too. If you want to go to a high Mass and be immersed by the ceremony and the grandeur and never even looking at a missal, you can do that. But some people, including myself, like to look at the text and meditate on it. A text that has been the foundation of Western civilization for hundreds of years. And a missal is a great way to catch a glimmer of the whole shine and be mesmerized at it. I realistically think you could spend your entire life meditating on the introit of one Mass or just the prayers at the foot of the altar. A missal is something that you can go back to again and again and renew your interest in the faith and in the liturgy. It's a deeply personal decision which missal you want to use, and I hope that this video made that a little bit easier. God bless.